In 1941, the Royal Navy was fighting a losing battle against German U-boats, sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate. The war at sea was tipping in favor of the Germans, and Britain was running out of time. Desperation loomed. Then, a controversial cargo emerged, a weapon so effective that it would change the course of the war. But for 2 years, the Navy banned it. Why? Because it was too dangerous. And yet, this forbidden cargo would go on to sink 7 German submarines. This is the untold story of the Navy's banned weapon. March 17, 1941, 0345 hours. The North Atlantic, 40 miles northeast of Ireland. Commander Richard Taylor stands on the bridge of the HMS Eagle, gripping the cold steel rail. Below, a convoy of 26 merchant vessels fights through the heavy seas. These ships are carrying the lifeblood of Britain: food, ammunition, fuel. The men aboard them have no idea what's lurking beneath the waves. German U-boats circle like predators, hungry for the vulnerable cargo. Commander Taylor doesn't yet know that this night will rewrite naval history. As the convoy battles its way through 30-foot swells, the shadow of danger looms. Unseen, the U-boats stalk their prey. But what Taylor doesn't know, what no one knows yet, is that the very cargo he is protecting, a seemingly ordinary shipment, will soon become one of the Navy's most controversial weapons. Banned for 2 years, this cargo will help sink 7 German submarines in a matter of weeks. But what makes this cargo so dangerous, so powerful, and why was it outlawed in the first place? This cargo, which the Admiralty had dismissed as too risky, would soon prove to be the game-changer the Royal Navy had been desperately searching for. But it wouldn't come without consequences. What was considered too dangerous for the fleet would save it. This is the story of the cargo that the Navy banned, and how it sank 7 of Germany's most feared U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition. German U-boats were picking off British merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Britain's supply lines were under siege, and it seemed that the war at sea might be lost. By the end of 1940, the Royal Navy had lost 471 merchant vessels and over 2.5 million tons of vital cargo to German submarines. Each month, the losses continued to rise. The situation was dire. The Royal Navy's primary weapon to fight the U-boats was the depth charge. These explosive devices were designed to explode at predetermined depths, releasing a shockwave powerful enough to damage or destroy a submarine. But the method had its flaws. In 1940, the Royal Navy's success rate with depth charges was only 3%. For every 100 attacks, only 3 resulted in a confirmed kill. U-boat commanders had adapted, learning to dive deeper than the depth charges could reach, thus avoiding destruction. Despite the mounting losses, the Royal Navy continued to rely on depth charges. The strategy was outdated, and the results were grim. The Admiralty, stubbornly holding on to the belief that depth charges were the answer, failed to acknowledge that the weapon's limitations were too great. They needed something new, something that could level the playing field. But no one had any real ideas. No one, except for Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Hall. Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Hall wasn't an officer with prestigious academic credentials or groundbreaking naval inventions. He was, however, someone who couldn't simply accept failure. Stationed aboard the HMS Vanguard, Hall had been part of numerous convoy missions in the North Atlantic. Over the course of many months, he had watched helplessly as convoy after convoy was decimated by German U-ships sank, men perished, and Britain's supply lines were continuously under threat. It was a grim, unending cycle. Hall was a man of action, not one to accept acceptable losses. He spent sleepless nights going over attack reports, calculating the missed opportunities, studying the patterns of U-boat evasion, and looking for any flaw in the Navy's anti-submarine tactics. What he realized, after countless hours of study, was shocking. The Navy was using depth charges completely wrong. The current standard for depth charges was based on tactics developed in World War I. When submarines were relatively shallow-dwelling, depth charges were set to detonate at a range of 150 feet to 300 feet, designed to hit older, more traditional submarines that typically operated at those depths. But the new Type 7 U-boats, the most common German submarine at the time, could dive to depths of 750 feet, far deeper than the charges could reach. It didn't take a naval genius to see that these settings were far outdated. While the Admiralty clung to these conventional tactics, the U-boat commanders had adapted. They learned how to dive deeper and evade the depth charges with ease. Hall began to wonder, what if the depth charges weren't the problem? What if the real issue was the settings? What if there was a better way to use them? Hall's proposal was simple. Alter the depth charge settings. Instead of using fixed depths of 150 feet and 300 feet, he suggested setting some charges to detonate at much shallower depths, 50 feet and 100 feet. His idea was to create a multi-layered attack where the charges would detonate at different depths, essentially walling off the U-boat's potential escape routes. This would not only force the U-boats to stay within the blast zone, but also minimize their ability to dive deeper to evade the attack. Hall wasn't a scientist or engineer, and his proposal didn't come with elaborate blueprints or scientific models. It was based on simple logic and a lot of hard data he had collected through months of observation. But that didn't matter to the higher-ups in the Royal Navy. The Admiralty had long been resistant to change. New tactics and strategies had to be approved through the proper channels, and Hall's position as a junior officer, without the credentials or connections to influence the Navy's hierarchy, worked against him. So, Hall did what most would consider impossible. He ignored the official process and took the matter into his own hands. He wrote out a formal proposal, documenting all his findings, and sent it straight to the Admiralty. His idea was nothing short of revolutionary, yet it was met with the usual bureaucratic resistance. A memo came back swiftly, stamped and read, "Rejected. The proposal violates established protocols and cannot be considered." Hall was devastated, but he refused to give up. The war was too critical, and the stakes were far too high to simply walk away. As the months passed, the losses mounted. The convoys continued to fall victim to the U-boats, and Hall became more and more determined to prove his method worked. But how could he convince the Admiralty to listen? The breakthrough came when Commander Gilbert Roberts, who ran the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, caught wind of Hall's rejected proposal. Roberts was a seasoned officer, known for his independent thinking and unconventional approach to naval strategy. Unlike most, he wasn't afraid to challenge authority if the situation demanded it, and what he saw in Hall's proposal intrigued him. The Western Approaches Command, located in Liverpool, was a secretive wargaming unit that tested new tactics and strategies for naval warfare. Roberts was looking for any edge that could tip the balance in Britain's favor, and Hall's proposal seemed like just the kind of idea he needed to explore. He called Hall in for a meeting and asked him to explain his theory in more detail. Hall laid out his calculations, showing how the standard depth charge attacks were ineffective against U-boats that could dive deeper than the prescribed detonation depths. His modified settings, he argued, would create a much higher probability of hitting the target. Instead of relying on outdated assumptions about submarine depth, Hall proposed that the depth charges be set to explode at varying levels minus 50 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet, to catch the submarines as they attempted to dive away from the initial blast. Roberts was impressed. He immediately understood that Hall's idea could make a significant impact, but testing it under real-world conditions would be crucial. He decided to take the risk and test Hall's modified depth charge settings in secret. Roberts knew the risks. The Navy's strict protocols forbade any deviation from the established methods, and failure could mean disaster for both him and Hall. But Roberts was a man of action, and the time for bureaucratic delays had passed. The first test of Hall's modified depth charge settings came on March 8, 1941. The HMS Eagle and its escort ship, the HMS Vanguard, were on a routine convoy protection mission off the coast of Ireland. Commander Taylor, who had already been informed of the experiment, was instructed to implement Hall's new depth charge settings. The mission was high risk, but the situation was desperate. The convoy was under constant threat from German U-boats, and the Navy's conventional tactics had failed time and time again. As the convoy sailed on, the tension was palpable. The sea was calm for the moment, but every sailor knew the danger was imminent. The enemy U-boats, unseen beneath the waves, were likely waiting for the opportune moment to strike. And then, a sonar operator aboard the Eagle made the call. Contact. The U-boat was detected, lurking deep beneath the surface. As the convoy ships started their evasive maneuvers, Commander Taylor ordered the modified depth charge settings to be activated. The new settings, designed by Hall, would target varying depths, 50 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet, creating an unpredictable and dangerous zone for the U-boat. As the destroyers neared the contact point, the tension built. The sonar operator confirmed the position once more, and the orders were given to release the charges. The sea erupted in violent explosions, but this wasn't the usual white geysers of water that followed a depth charge attack. This time, the explosions came in quick succession at different depths, as the charges detonated at staggered intervals. For a brief moment, there was nothing. Then, a massive shockwave rocked the sea. The water turned black, thick with oil and debris. The U-boat had surfaced, its hull severely damaged by the blasts. Oil slicks spread across the surface, a grim signal of the damage below the waves. The crew of the U-boat scrambled to abandon ship, their hands raised in surrender. It had worked. The first successful attack using Hall's modified depth charge settings had taken place, and the results were undeniable. The U-boat, which had been lurking undetected just moments before, was now defeated. The Royal Navy had scored its first major victory in months, and it came not from the Admiralty's standard procedures, but from a daring modification proposed by a lower-ranking officer who was willing to challenge the status quo. News of the success spread quickly through the Royal Navy. Though the Admiralty had dismissed Hall's proposal outright, the results of the attack were impossible to ignore. For the first time, the modified depth charge settings had proven effective. The kill rate, which had remained dismally low for months, had just increased dramatically. But success would not come easily. The Admiralty was still hesitant to accept Hall's modifications. The Navy's top brass had always adhered to strict protocols, and changing the way the depth charges were deployed felt like a breach of military discipline. Some saw Hall's methods as an infringement on established doctrine, a dangerous deviation from the conventional approach. Others, however, were starting to see the potential for success. Despite the reluctance from high-ranking officers, Roberts was convinced that Hall's approach was the future of anti-submarine warfare. The next step was clear. The modifications needed to be tested in the field, and the Navy had to see the results firsthand. But there was a problem. The Admiralty had explicitly forbidden any further use of the modified depth charge settings. Hall's idea was still considered an unauthorized modification, and using it without permission could result in severe consequences for everyone involved. Roberts was not one to back down in the face of adversity. He knew that if the Navy was going to win the war at sea, it needed to change. And change, he believed, could only come through actions, not through endless debates in the Admiralty. The risk was immense, but the potential reward was even greater. With Roberts' support, Hall's modified depth charge settings were quietly put into use once again, this time in even more critical operations. The next series of tests took place in April 1941, a month after the success of the first operational use of Hall's modified depth charge settings. The modified tactic had proven its worth, but the real test was still ahead. The North Atlantic remained a dangerous battlefield, with German U-boats continuing to wreak havoc on British convoys. The Navy had no choice but to push forward with experimentation. Despite the official ban, there was simply no time to wait for bureaucratic approval. The HMS Vanguard and the HMS Eagle were once again tasked with protecting a vital convoy. This time, the convoy was carrying not only food and fuel, but also critical supplies for the Royal Air Force and the Army. If the convoy were lost, it could seriously cripple Britain's war efforts. The mission was critical, and failure was not an option. The U-boats were getting bolder. They had learned the patterns of the Royal Navy's attacks, and the standard depth charge methods were no longer enough to keep them at bay. As the convoy navigated the rough seas, the inevitable happened. A U-boat was detected. The sonar operator aboard Eagle confirmed the contact, and Commander Taylor gave the order to proceed with the modified depth charge settings once again. The moment of truth had arrived. The convoy was at risk, and the modified tactics would either prove themselves or fail miserably. The depth charges, set to detonate at varying depths, were ready. The Navy had no other option but to trust in Hall's innovation. The U-boat was closing in, and the crew of Eagle had to act quickly. The destroyer veered toward the contact, with the convoy following at a safe distance. As the destroyers approached, the tension on board Eagle was palpable. The officers and crew knew the stakes were high. The modified depth charge tactics were still a secret, and if they failed, it could lead to the end of their careers. But with the lives of hundreds of men aboard the convoy ships at stake, there was no time to hesitate. The attack began. This time, instead of relying on sonar alone to determine the U-boat's location, the modified tactics allowed for real-time updates on the submarine's movements. As the depth charges were released, they detonated in rapid succession, each explosion designed to create a wall of deadly force. The sea erupted. The usual white explosions were replaced with a much more devastating result. The water turned black with oil, and debris began to surface. This was the result Hall had predicted. The U-boat, unable to escape the trap, was forced to surface. It was badly damaged, oil leaking from its hull, its crew scrambling to abandon ship. They had no choice but to surrender. Another U-boat had been destroyed. As the crew of Eagle watched the enemy vessel surface, the realization set in. This new method was working. The first successful attack had been one thing, but now, with the stakes raised and a convoy's survival on the line, the modified tactics had proven themselves under even more pressure. The news of this second victory reached the Admiralty within hours. For the first time, the Navy's leadership was forced to confront the truth. The conventional methods were no longer effective. The success of Hall's modified depth charge settings could not be ignored any longer. But, despite the undeniable success, the Admiralty was still resistant to formalizing the tactic. The Admiralty had long prided itself on its tradition and established doctrine. Change came slowly in the Navy, especially when the changes came from lower-ranking officers like Hall. There was a sense of pride in the Navy's history and its traditions, and for many, admitting that the old ways didn't work felt like a blow to that pride. But the successes in the field were hard to ignore. In the months that followed, Hall and Roberts continued to push for the adoption of the modified depth charge settings across the fleet, but the Admiralty remained reluctant. There were still powerful voices within the Navy that viewed Hall's innovations as an inconvenience, a disruption to the carefully laid out plans of senior officers. They saw Hall as a troublemaker, someone who questioned established wisdom, and in the world of military hierarchy, questioning the status quo was often met with hostility. However, the victories continued to stack up. With each successful attack, the kill rate against U-boats began to rise. The modified depth charges were working, and the Germans were starting to lose their grip on the Atlantic. Hall's methods, though still not officially endorsed, were becoming the go-to strategy for U-boat hunters in the Royal Navy. The situation was reaching a boiling point. The Navy's leadership could no longer ignore the results. The modified tactics, though initially forbidden, were proving to be the key to turning the tide of the war in the Atlantic. By the summer of 1941, Hall's modified depth charge settings were no longer just an experimental tactic. They had become a critical tool in the Royal Navy's fight against the U-boats. The kill rate had improved dramatically, and British convoys were beginning to feel safer. Though the U-boats were still a constant threat, the Admiralty, however, was still hesitant to fully embrace the new tactics. Hall's innovation had saved lives, but it had also created friction with the Navy's traditional command structure. Despite the continued success in the field, the official position of the Admiralty was clear. No officer, especially not one of Hall's rank, could simply change established procedures without approval. The message was simple: follow the rules or face the consequences. Hall's proposals were still considered unauthorized modifications, and the Navy's senior officers were determined to maintain control over the tactical direction of the war. But as the months passed, the pressure from the front lines continued to mount. More and more U-boats were being sunk, and Hall's tactics were becoming increasingly recognized by those in the field as the future of anti-submarine warfare. Naval commanders, desperate to protect their convoys and maintain momentum, began to unofficially adopt Hall's methods. There was a growing sense that the Admiralty could not ignore the results for much longer. In September 1941, another convoy, this time carrying crucial supplies for the Allied forces in Africa, came under attack by German U-boats. The situation was critical. The convoy could not afford to lose even a single ship, and the risk of failure was enormous. Commander Taylor of the HMS Eagle, now fully convinced of the efficacy of Hall's tactics, gave the order to proceed with the modified depth charge settings once more. The convoy was navigating through the perilous waters off the coast of France when the U-boats made their move. They had waited in the shadows, calculating the perfect time to strike, but the modified tactics had already turned the tables. As the convoy's escort ships, including Eagle, deployed the modified charges, they quickly gained the upper hand. The depth charges detonated in rapid succession at varying depths, creating a deadly wall of explosions that the U-boats had no way of evading. This time, the results were even more devastating than before. The first U-boat was destroyed in a matter of minutes, and the crew had no chance to escape. Within hours, another U-boat was sunk, and the convoy continued its journey without losing a single ship. The success rate of the modified depth charges had surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. This time, the Admiralty could no longer deny the truth. Hall's modified tactics were not just effective, they were revolutionary. The success of the convoy and the sinking of 2 U-boats was a turning point in the war at sea. The Royal Navy's leadership could not ignore the results any longer. The Admiralty had been wrong. Hall had been right all along. But despite the undeniable evidence, the Navy's bureaucracy was slow to act. The Admiralty continued to drag its feet, reluctant to formally recognize Hall's innovation. The modified depth charge settings were still not officially adopted fleet-wide. For Hall, the battle was far from over. While his methods had proven themselves time and time again, the road to full acceptance would be long and difficult. In the months that followed, Hall and Roberts continued to press the Admiralty for official approval, but the Navy's senior officers remained hesitant. The idea of changing the Royal Navy's tactics so radically was still a difficult pill to swallow. There were still many within the upper echelons who believed that the Navy's success was due to traditional methods, and that any deviation from those methods would lead to chaos. Hall's patience was running thin. He had already proven that his methods worked, but the Navy's leadership was still unwilling to fully embrace change. He was a junior officer, after all, and he had no formal education in naval tactics or strategy. He was simply a man who had watched the failures of the old system and had decided to do something about it. But the bureaucracy of the Navy was an immovable force. Hall knew that the success of his methods could not be denied for much longer, but the Navy's unwillingness to acknowledge his innovation was becoming a barrier he could no longer ignore. By late 1941, the pressure on the Admiralty to adopt Hall's modifications had reached a breaking point. The success in the field could not be ignored any longer. The Royal Navy had witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of the modified depth charge settings. Yet the Admiralty's leadership remained locked in its resistance to change. In the meantime, Hall had become more and more frustrated by the bureaucracy that had once dismissed his work as dangerous and untested. In private meetings, Commander Roberts continued to push for the full adoption of Hall's tactics, but his calls were often met with the same response from the Admiralty: continue experimenting. But no formal adoption yet. The Navy was stuck in a dangerous limbo. They had found something that worked, but could not officially approve it without further analysis and testing. The political weight of tradition and hierarchy was just too strong to move quickly. Yet, as the U-boat threat grew more pronounced with each passing month, the war was evolving. Britain's supply lines were continuously under siege, and the Atlantic convoys were becoming more vulnerable. If the U-boats continued to sink ships at the same rate, Britain's survival could be in jeopardy by the end of 1942. The modified tactics, which had already begun to deliver results, represented a potential turning point, but it was becoming clear that the Admiralty needed more convincing. Then, in early December 1941, a pivotal event occurred that would force the Navy's hand. Another critical convoy, which was carrying crucial war supplies for the Middle East, came under attack by a large group of German U-boats. The convoy was located in the midst of a particularly treacherous stretch of the North Atlantic. The U-boats launched a relentless assault, and the convoy's ships were in danger of being lost one by one. Commander Taylor of the HMS Eagle, knowing the stakes and having witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of Hall's modifications, issued the order to implement the new depth charge settings. This was no longer an experimental tactic. It was the only chance the convoy had of surviving. The U-boats, lurking beneath the waves, began their approach, hoping to catch the convoy off guard. But this time, the modified depth charge tactics were ready, as the sonar operators aboard the Eagle locked onto the positions of the submarines. The destroyers deployed the depth charges, but not according to the standard methods. Instead, the charges exploded in rapid succession, at varying depths. The wall of explosions quickly forced the U-boats to maneuver, but it was too late. Within minutes, the first U-boat was destroyed. The convoy's escort ships did not let up. The depth charges continued to detonate with precision, creating a deadly zone that the U-boats couldn't escape. Within hours, the convoy had lost no ships, and 2 more U-boats were sunk. The convoy made it safely to port, thanks to the success of Hall's modified tactics. It was one of the most significant victories in the Battle of the Atlantic, but it was also a wake-up call for the Admiralty. The success of this convoy was a powerful demonstration of the modified depth charge settings' effectiveness. Hall's methods had, in essence, saved the convoy, and in doing so, saved thousands of lives. The tide of the war at sea was slowly beginning to turn. No one could deny the success any longer. At this point, the Admiralty had no choice but to act. Hall's tactics had proven themselves time and time again, and the Navy's leadership was finally forced to acknowledge the undeniable truth. The old methods weren't working, and Hall's innovations were the future. It was time for the Navy to adopt the new tactics, whether they liked it or not. A meeting was scheduled to discuss the implementation of Hall's tactics across the fleet. High-ranking officers, including Commander Roberts, Hall himself, and even Admiral Sir Percy Noble, who had supported the modifications in secret, gathered to formally discuss the next steps. The Admiralty, in a moment of reluctant acknowledgement, agreed to begin using Hall's modified depth charge settings across the fleet. For Hall, it was a bittersweet victory. After all the resistance, the rejection, and the challenges he had faced, the Navy was finally adopting his tactics, but not without a long and difficult battle. It was a reminder of how innovation often comes from the most unexpected places, and how the entrenched powers of tradition can be a barrier to progress. By 1942, Hall's modified depth charge settings had finally been adopted fleet-wide, but the road to full implementation was not without its hurdles. While the Admiralty had formally recognized the effectiveness of the modified tactics, the true challenge lay in ensuring that all ships and commanders were properly trained and equipped to use them. The modified depth charge settings required a level of coordination and precision that had not been present in previous naval operations. It was one thing to approve the tactic in principle, and another to ensure it was executed flawlessly across the entire fleet. The Royal Navy was still operating under a heavy burden of traditional naval doctrines, and the implementation of new tactics was met with skepticism by some of the older, more senior officers. Even as the results from the field continued to speak for themselves, there were those who resisted the changes. The idea of a junior officer like Hall, someone without formal academic credentials or significant influence shaping the future of naval strategy, was difficult for many to accept. But Hall's modifications had saved too many lives to be ignored. The success of the convoy operations in 1941, where multiple U-boats were destroyed using Hall's methods, had proven that the modified depth charge settings were not just effective, but revolutionary. The kill rate against U-boats increased substantially, and the convoys, once easy targets for the Germans, now had a fighting chance. The true turning point came in the spring of 1942, when a critical convoy in the Mediterranean came under heavy attack by German U-boats. The convoy was carrying vital supplies for the Allied forces in North Africa, and its failure would have been catastrophic. As the convoy navigated through the dangerous waters, it came under attack by a fleet of U-boats. The situation was dire. This time, Commander Roberts was in charge of the convoy's protection, and he immediately ordered the use of Hall's modified depth charge settings. The convoy's escort ships, including the Eagle, deployed the charges as they had been trained to do. The result was almost instantaneous. The first U-boat was destroyed within minutes, and the others, caught in the trap, were forced to retreat. In the end, no ships in the convoy were lost, and 3 U-boats were sunk. The Mediterranean convoy operation marked the definitive moment when Hull's tactics were no longer considered a novelty. They were now an integral part of the Royal Navy's arsenal. The success was a vindication of Hull's persistence, and it proved that innovation, when driven by necessity, could change the course of a war. As the success stories piled up, the Admiralty's reluctance to fully embrace Hull's methods began to wane. The modified depth charge settings were no longer just a secret tactic used by a handful of commanders. They had become the new standard for anti-submarine warfare. But even as the Navy embraced the changes, Hull's journey was far from over. The process of formalizing the tactic and ensuring it was consistently used across the fleet was an ongoing challenge. By the summer of 1942, the Royal Navy's success rate with U-boat kills had more than doubled. The modified depth charge settings, combined with better coordination between escort ships, had proven to be the key to turning the tide of the battle in the Atlantic. But the war was far from won. The Germans were adapting quickly, developing new tactics and technology to counter the Allied advancements. The U-boats were far from finished. Hull, however, was determined to keep refining his methods. He had already proven that his ideas worked, but he knew that if the Navy was to keep ahead of the Germans, it needed to evolve constantly. Every attack, every mission, was an opportunity to learn and improve. Hull began experimenting with even more advanced tactics, including the coordination of multiple ships to conduct what would later be known as creeping attacks, a technique that would allow for near-perfect tracking of U-boats and a higher success rate in attacking them. As Hull's innovations gained more traction, his status in the Navy began to shift. Though still a relatively low-ranking officer, he had earned the respect of his peers and superiors. His work was no longer dismissed as the musings of a junior officer. It was now seen as vital to the success of the Royal Navy's efforts in the Battle of the Atlantic. However, as Hull's star rose, so did the complexity of his relationship with the Admiralty. The bureaucratic hurdles remained, and there were still officers who were wary of deviating too far from traditional tactics. But Hull's continued success made it clear that the Royal Navy needed to keep pushing the envelope. Innovation, not tradition, was now the Navy's best weapon in the fight against the U-boats. As the war continued into 1943, Hull's modified depth charge tactics had become the backbone of the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare strategy. The increase in successful kills was undeniable, and the Germans began to take notice. U-boat losses began to mount, and by mid-1943, the Allies were sinking more submarines than the Germans could build. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had finally begun to turn in favor of Britain, thanks in no small part to Hull's innovations. But despite his undeniable success, Hull's recognition within the Navy was still a complicated matter. While his tactical brilliance had saved countless lives and turned the war at sea, his career advancement had stalled. Despite being directly responsible for one of the Navy's most important innovations, Hull had not received the promotion or accolades that would typically accompany such a contribution. His status as a lower-ranking officer without the academic pedigree or connections of his peers kept him from reaching the upper echelons of the Navy's leadership. Even more frustrating for Hull was the fact that, although his modified depth charges were now standard procedure across the fleet, his work was still largely unacknowledged in official naval histories. His tactics, though revolutionary, had not been formally named. Too many sailors, however, Hull's innovation was known simply as Walker's Way, a quiet tribute to the man who had changed the course of naval warfare without ever seeking fame or glory. In 1944, Hull was finally promoted to captain, but by then, he had already seen the consequences of his earlier struggles. The Navy had adopted his tactics, but they had never truly accepted the man behind them. Hull continued to serve with distinction throughout the remainder of the war, but his health had been deteriorating. The stress and exhaustion of years of intense combat had taken their toll. In July 1944, just weeks after the success of D-Day, Hull died of a stroke, caused by the relentless pressure he had placed on himself during the war. He was only 48 years old. At his funeral, thousands of sailors lined the streets of Liverpool to pay their respects. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, sent a personal telegram. Captain Walker was one of the outstanding commanders in the Battle of the Atlantic. His record of U-boat kills is unequaled, and his work saved thousands of lives. The Royal Navy has lost one of its greatest officers, but despite the recognition, after his death, Hall never received the honors he truly deserved while he was alive. He never received a knighthood, never became an admiral, and never commanded anything larger than an escort group. The Navy had used his tactics, but it had never fully embraced him. It was as if his insubordination, his refusal to accept the traditional way of doing things, had forever marked him as an outsider in the eyes of the senior officers. In the years that followed the war, the true impact of Hall's contributions became clearer. His innovations in anti-submarine warfare were still used by the Navy for decades. The principles of multiple depth targeting, coordinated tracking, and real-time attack adjustments became the foundation for modern submarine warfare. The United States Navy adopted similar tactics, and Hall's methods were even taught at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where they became an integral part of the curriculum for future officers. NATO's anti-submarine warfare protocols also referenced Hall's innovations, cementing his legacy as one of the most influential naval tacticians of the 20th century. Today, Hall's methods are still used in anti-submarine warfare, and his legacy lives on in the men and women who continue to protect the seas. He may never have received the official recognition he deserved, but the impact of his work cannot be overstated. His willingness to challenge tradition, to question the established doctrines, and to push for a better way of doing things saved countless lives during World War II and helped secure Britain's victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Hall's story is a testament to the power of innovation, the importance of perseverance in the face of bureaucracy, and the quiet determination of those who see a problem and refuse to accept failure. In the end, his legacy is not just about the tactics he created, but about the lives he saved and the lessons he taught about the value of challenging the status quo in the pursuit of a greater good.